Music. The moment, planned as a glamorous start to a new international offensive, transformed within minutes into a diplomatic fiasco. When Meghan Markle landed at Dubai International Airport on February 4, 2026, observers expected a discreet visit with a high-profile entourage and a smooth transition to a tightly controlled media agenda. Instead, the appearance ended abruptly at the border. Without public explanation, without any visible incident, but with maximum symbolic power, she was denied entry. What followed marked not only the failure of a trip, but the beginning of an international reckoning with a figure who had long lived off her past. According to sources close to the trip, Dubai had been chosen as a strategic hub. High-level meetings with brand representatives, discreet talks with regional media figures, and an exclusive dinner with investors from the Gulf region were planned. At the heart of it all was a campaign scheduled for March, intended to be staged as a fresh start. But this plan collapsed within the terminal. Border officials asked Meghan Markle to undergo a routine check in a separate room. There was no escalation, no legal dispute, no official explanation. After a short time, her passport was returned, along with a matter-of-fact request to take the next available return flight. This silence resonated louder than any press release. In a city known for controlled images, Markle-free procedures, and strict discretion, the refusal was seen as a deliberate signal. Meghan Markle left the terminal without cameras, without a statement, without an escort. The expectation of red carpets gave way to an invisible barrier. It was already clear at this point that this was not a technical error, but a decision with political and reputational implications. The real turning point, however, did not come at the airport, but immediately afterward. Instead of requesting support through the appropriate U.S. authorities, Meghan Markle sought contact with British channels. The argument, according to diplomatic sources, was based on her marriage to Prince Harry and her role as mother of Prince Archie and Princess Lilibet. This implicitly attempted to assert a form of symbolic special status that had been considered unresolved for years. This initiative set off a chain reaction whose consequences extended far beyond Dubai. The request was forwarded to the palace and, instead of being softened, was rejected outright. Within hours, it was clear that there would be no quiet mediation. Instead, a hard line emerged, ruling out any form of institutional support. Thus, a border decision became an international signal. The trip to Dubai had not only failed, it had opened a door behind which years of pent-up tensions erupted. Simultaneously, planned appointments began to disappear. Internal calendars were scrapped, preparations for media appearances were frozen, and interlocutors cancelled at short notice. The campaign planned for March lost its foundation even before it had been publicly announced. The investors stated that they had reassessed the situation. Uncertainty, legal gray areas, and political sensitivity were suddenly deemed incompatible with their own brand strategies. The rejection in Dubai thus acted as a catalyst. It brought together doubts that had previously been building up gradually and made them visible. What was intended as a controlled restart turned out to be an exposure of structural weaknesses. The assumption that international stages could be accessed solely through fame and a past proved to be a miscalculation. That same day, it became clear that this episode would not remain an isolated incident. In diplomatic circles, questions began to be raised about the true resilience of the remaining symbolism surrounding Meghan Markle. Was Dubai merely the first domino to fall? Or did this moment mark the definitive transition from global attention to institutional rejection? While the return journey was undertaken in silence, a new reality was already taking shape in the background. A reality in which old titles no longer opened doors and in which every step was re-evaluated. Was this the beginning of international isolation or just the prelude to an even greater escalation? What ultimately escalated the situation played out not in public, but in the closed channels of diplomacy. After being turned away at the airport, Meghan Markle didn't focus on the usual consular channels, but on a shortcut she apparently still considered viable. Instead of contacting the relevant U.S. authorities, she sought support through British contacts. This step appeared to be a mere formality from the outside, but internally it was explosive, as it raised a question that had long been kept under wraps. To what extent could she still rely on structures from which she had publicly distanced herself? From a diplomatic perspective, this move was considered highly problematic. The argument was based on her continuing marriage to Prince Harry and her role as mother of Prince Archie and Princess Lilibet. It was precisely this reference that made the matter so sensitive, as it implied that family ties could still be used as leverage for preferential treatment. In recent years, this assumption had been neither clearly confirmed nor definitively refuted. Dubai forced divorce. The request made its way through several levels of government before finally reaching the palace. There, it encountered not ambiguity, but a pre-prepared stance. Within a very short time, it became clear that the attempt to claim informal privileges was considered a transgression. The matter was documented, reviewed, and answered without delay. The response was not subtle, but deliberately unequivocal. Thus, an individual request became an institutional precedent. The core of the problem lay less in the request itself than in its symbolism. For years, a state of limbo had developed in which former titles, familial ties, and public prominence were intertwined. This limbo allowed for interpretations that were politically risky in sensitive regions. The Gulf states are known for their heightened awareness of reputation, stability, and clear lines of responsibility. A visitor claiming unclear roles is perceived there not as an opportunity, but as a risk. In this context, resorting to royal channels seemed like a relic from another era. The assumption that symbolic affiliation automatically carries diplomatic weight clashed with the realities of modern state logic. For the responsible authorities, this meant either continuing to accept this gray area or drawing a clear line. The decision was made in favor of clarity. Shortly thereafter, the rejection was not only confirmed but formalized. There was no offer of mediation, no discreet behind-the-scenes solution. Instead, the matter was considered closed. This stance signaled not only distance but also a deliberate demarcation. For international partners, this was a clear indication that previous assumptions about special status were no longer valid. At the same time, reports intensified that the request had served as an internal catalyst for long overdue clarifications. For some time, there had been a palpable unease in diplomatic circles about attempts to link private ventures with institutional symbolism. The incident in Dubai brought these concerns to the surface. It demonstrated how quickly personal initiatives can lead to political entanglements. The consequences were immediate. Interlocutors in the region began to re-evaluate their positions. Meetings were not only cancelled but removed from future plans. What had previously been considered a potentially lucrative collaboration was reassessed from the perspective of stability and predictability. In this environment, uncertainty was a deal-breaker. The attempt to gain support through royal connections thus proved to be a boo-boo-boo. Instead of opening doors, it accelerated their closure. It forced institutions to take a public stance and undermined a years-long state of limbo. The question now was no longer whether this step had been a mistake. The crucial question was what chain reactions it would trigger, and whether the resulting rift could even be repaired. The reaction from London was swifter and sharper than many observers had anticipated. What had previously existed behind closed doors as a source of tension was now given a clear institutional form. The palace opted against quiet diplomacy and for a public demarcation. This transformed the rejection in Dubai into an internationally perceptible turning point. The message was unmistakably based on past affiliations, not current authority. At the center of this reaction was Prince William. His statement was deliberately brief, yet precise. She left no room for interpretation and redefined responsibilities. Meghan Markle's travel activities and plans were private matters to be handled exclusively through the relevant consular authorities. No connection to the institution of the Crown existed. This wording was not chosen at random. It aimed to exclude any form of symbolic co-responsibility. This clarification ended years of simmering ambiguity. Since their withdrawal from official duties, a gray area had persisted in which familial ties, public perception, and former titles remained intertwined. This gray area had become increasingly difficult for international partners to understand. The palace's decision abruptly ended this uncertainty. It made it clear that there would be no more tacit exceptions. Shortly afterward, Princess Anne, whose role as a pragmatic administrator of institutional boundaries is widely known, offered her own assessment. She, too, made it clear that Meghan Markle and Prince Harry were not representatives of the monarchy. This statement was less emotional than strategic. It was not addressed to the public alone, but to diplomatic networks that rely on clear lines of authority. In these circles, the message was understood as final. The impact of this distancing extended far beyond the specific case. International partners took note of the clarification and adjusted their assessments. Where there had previously been uncertainty, there was now clarity, though not to the benefit of those affected. The palace's decision signaled that any future activity would take place without institutional backing. This fundamentally shifted the risk assessment. Music. For Meghan Markle, this meant a break with one of the last remaining levers of symbolic power. The possibility of invoking past affiliations in sensitive contexts was thus effectively extinguished. For states with a strong sense of security and reputation, this was a decisive factor. Without institutional protection, only the private individual remained, along with all the open questions and ongoing controversies. Within diplomatic circles, this step was interpreted as a rare but necessary measure. Public distancing of this kind is considered a last resort, when subtle signals are no longer sufficient. Music. That it came to this was seen as an indication of how serious the situation was considered. The palace drew a line to prevent further misunderstandings and to maintain the neutrality of the monarchy. At the same time, this moment marked a turning point in international perception. The narrative shifted from personal drama to institutional demarcation. It was no longer about individual ambitions, but about protecting a centuries-old structure. In this light, the decision seemed consistent if harsh. The question that now arose was of greater significance. If even the familial connection no longer offered a bridge, what options remained? Was this distancing an endpoint or merely the prelude to further clarifications on an international level? The answer would become clear sooner than many would have liked. With a clear demarcation from London, a chain reaction began that extended far beyond diplomatic matters. The incident in Dubai acted like a magnifying glass, focusing and exposing existing weaknesses. Projects that had previously been considered isolated difficulties now coalesced into a pattern. It became clear to observers that this was not a setback, but a structural crisis affecting multiple levels simultaneously. At its core was the rapid loss of economic viability. Months before the trip to Dubai, key partnerships had already begun to falter. Major media contracts had lost their substance. Development agreements were quietly reduced or terminated altogether. What had once been considered the financial foundation for an independent international career proved fragile. After the rejection in Dubai, this dynamic intensified. Investors and partners reassessed risks and withdrew before they themselves could become part of a public problem. At the same time, legal uncertainties intensified. Ongoing investigations and disputes gained new relevance due to the international attention. In sensitive markets, especially where government agencies are closely intertwined with economic actors, the mere appearance of legal ambiguity is enough to halt projects. The events in Dubai provided precisely this impression. They signaled the existence of open questions with uncertain outcomes. Even personal infrastructure came under pressure. Reports of unstable living conditions and financial obligations reinforced the image of a crumbling foundation. What had previously been presented as a conscious reorientation now appeared as forced adaptation. The loss of physical and organizational stability had an immediate impact on credibility. In the logic of international markets, reliability is a currency, and it seemed to be rapidly losing value. Added to this was the disintegration of a carefully constructed narrative. For years, attempts had been made to combine different roles: activist, entrepreneur, symbolic figure. However, these roles required different expectations and responsibilities. With the loss of institutional backing, they increasingly clashed. The public began to perceive contradictions that had previously been masked by professional staging. In this climate, even former supporters came under pressure. Those who continued to signal closeness risked being drawn into the vortex of controversy themselves. A distancing movement quickly began. Appointments were postponed, collaborations redefined, or terminated altogether. The dynamics were less emotional than calculated. In an environment that valued stability and predictability, any uncertainty became a disqualifying factor. The failed restart in the Middle East thus had a global impact. Regions previously considered alternative markets adopted a cautious stance. Talks were put on hold. Letters of intent lost their validity. Music. The impression solidified that a brand that had once thrived on international attention had itself become a liability. At the same time, the internal situation worsened. The pressure to develop new revenue streams increased while room for maneuver shrank. Strategies appeared increasingly reactive rather than visionary. Short-term rescue attempts dominated instead of long-term planning. For observers, this was a classic sign of a phase in which control is lost. The cascade of failed projects thus revealed a key insight. The withdrawal of institutional support music had not only symbolic significance but also concrete economic consequences. Without this protection, previous successes could no longer be replicated. The question that now arose was no longer whether individual projects could be saved. The crucial question was whether a fundamental rethink was possible, or whether the domino effect would continue, bringing even larger structures crashing down. At the heart of the decision to deny Meghan Markle entry was not emotion, but calculation. The Gulf states follow a clear logic. Stability, control, and predictability are top priorities. Public figures there are not judged by their popularity, but by their potential influence on the national image. In this context, the Dubai case became a textbook example of modern risk assessment. The message was clear. Fame alone is no guarantee of entry if it is accompanied by uncertainty. Dubai is considered a global showcase where every appearance is part of a larger narrative. Visitors with international appeal are carefully vetted, not for criminal offenses, but for their potential to trigger narratives that could spiral out of control. And this was precisely where the problem lay. Meghan Markle brought not only attention but also a long chain of open controversies, contradictory portrayals, and unresolved conflicts. For a system that relies on staging events without a Markle image, this was a calculable risk and therefore unacceptable. The legal basis for this decision is deliberately broad. Border authorities have extensive discretion to deny entry without giving reasons. This practice is not an exception but part of a preventative strategy. It allows potential problems to be avoided before they become public. In this case, it was applied to stop a development that was deemed uncontrollable. Added to this was the international context. The Gulf states closely monitor Western media landscapes. They observe how quickly personal stories can be politicized and how rapidly individual crises can erupt into global debates. In this perception, Meghan Markle was not seen as a neutral visitor, but as a catalyst for attention whose direction was hardly predictable. For governments that rely on clear narratives, this is a deal-breaker. Dubai's decision also served as a signal to other states in the region. It demonstrated a willingness to set limits for prominent figures when the benefits are unclear. This stance quickly resonated. Discussions in neighboring countries became more cautious, with scrutiny becoming more rigorous. Music. Where presumption had prevailed, caution now took its place. The regional logic is simple. If an actor is perceived as a risk, this assessment spreads rapidly. This logic also played a central role economically. Investments in the Gulf region are closely linked to national reputation. Brands, media projects, and personalities are not viewed in isolation, but as part of a larger picture. Every collaboration sends a signal both domestically and internationally. In Meghan Markle's case, the potential costs outweighed the anticipated gains. The possible damage to her image appeared greater than any short-term publicity gain. The ambiguity surrounding roles and intentions was particularly decisive. Was the visit motivated by private business interests or media strategy? This ambiguity intensified skepticism. In a region that values clear responsibilities, vagueness is considered a warning sign. Music. The lack of institutional backing from London further reinforced this impression. Music. They stripped the trip of any remaining semblance of legitimacy. The power logic of the Gulf is thus less harsh than it appears. It is preventive and strategic. It avoids escalation by drawing boundaries early on. The Dubai case exemplified how quickly doors close when a person is no longer considered a predictable factor. For Meghan Markle, this meant not only a failed trip but the loss of a potentially music-crucial market. The crucial question, however, remains open. Was this rejection a regionally limited signal or the beginning of a global reassessment? If even the traditionally discrete power centers of the Gulf were distant, which international arenas remain accessible, and under what conditions? With the failure of the Dubai trip, the development reached a point where personal, economic, and symbolic dimensions became inextricably intertwined. The rejection was no longer merely a foreign policy signal, but had repercussions domestically. For Meghan Markle, it represented a break that exacerbated existing tensions and raised new questions. Observers noted that the focus shifted from expansion to damage control. Strategies previously geared toward growth were hastily adjusted to minimize losses. This was particularly evident in their private lives. The public perception of a united front began to crumble. Reports of differing visions for the future and priorities intensified. While Meghan Markle continued to pursue international platforms and new markets, Prince Harry appeared increasingly reserved. This divergence did not go unnoticed. In an environment characterized by the pressure of financial uncertainty and public scrutiny, conflicts escalate faster than they can be resolved. The narrative of self-determination also came under pressure. What had once been celebrated as a bold step toward independence now appeared as a risky maneuver without a safety net. The distancing from London had severed the last institutional point of reference. This provided not only symbolic support but also an important safeguard against international reluctance. Without this backing, all activities had to be re-legitimized, a task that proved increasingly difficult. A clear shift became apparent in the international arena. Contacts that had previously seemed promising became less frequent. Invitations turned into requests for meetings. The rejection in Dubai acted as a benchmark, a point others followed. It served as a subtle warning that caution was advised. For someone whose public presence had long relied on global visibility, this represented a significant restriction of her room for maneuver. At the same time, the pressure mounted to find a new narrative. The existing role models no longer worked. Neither the portrayal of herself as a victim nor that of a global entrepreneur was entirely convincing. Too many contradictions existed. Too many open questions remained unanswered. It became clear during this phase that a new state could not be established simply by relocating or launching new projects. It would have required a fundamental reorientation. For observers, this moment marked the transition from crisis to consequence. Events had developed a momentum of their own that could no longer be fully controlled. Past decisions continued to have repercussions and shaped the present. The scope for action shrank, while the demands for transparency and clarity increased. In this tense environment, every further move was closely scrutinized. The central question now was whether a withdrawal from public life was conceivable, or whether the attempt to maintain relevance would inevitably generate new conflicts. Both options carried risks. A complete withdrawal would have cemented the loss of influence. Another foray onto the international stage could have provoked renewed rejection. The margin for error had become minimal. Ultimately, a turning point had emerged that extended beyond individual projects. The events had demonstrated how quickly symbolic power can dissipate when it is not supported by stable structures. For Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, the question was no longer about the next big step, but about the fundamental direction. Was a reorientation possible, or was the path back to a controlled public sphere definitively blocked? The rejection of Meghan Markle at Dubai airport transformed within days from a seemingly administrative matter into an international signal with far-reaching consequences. What was planned as a discreet prelude to new projects turned out to be the catalyst for a comprehensive reassessment. Dubai's decision, based on proactive risk management and a clear image policy, revealed the low tolerance for ambiguity in sensitive centers of power. The subsequent attempt to activate royal channels accelerated this development. Instead of generating support, it led to a clear distancing from London. Prince William and Princess Anne thus drew an institutional line under years of ambivalence. This clarification deprived a whole series of projects of their symbolic foundation and increased the reluctance of international partners. As a result, economic ventures collapsed, legal uncertainties gained weight, and the carefully constructed narrative lost credibility. The power dynamics of the Gulf acted as a mirror reflecting a broader international trend. Reputation and predictability count for more than name recognition. Those perceived as unpredictable are shunned. The crisis also revealed fractures on a personal level. Differing strategies and expectations came to light, reinforcing the impression of a period of reorientation under immense pressure. Ultimately, what remains is a turning point that not only ended individual plans but also raised fundamental questions. Is a fresh start without institutional backing realistic? Can public relevance exist without stable structures? Or does Dubai mark the moment when international stages permanently close?